Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Refold Podcast. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today, we're joined by Gabriele from Italy. He's a student of South Asian languages, and he also has a YouTube channel where he teaches Sumerian.
All right, and welcome to the Refold Podcast, Gabriele.
It's great to finally put a face to the name.
Likewise.
Now, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, your background with languages and the language community?
Sure. So my name is Gabriele. I am 21 years old. I'm a student at the University of Venice. I major in South Asian studies, and I study Mandarin, Chinese, and Turkish as my first languages. And I am one of the moderators of the Link Discord server. I also happen to teach Sumerian and other languages online, and I am a passionate language learner. I guess that would be a good term for it.
Yeah, you moderate or sort of an admin, I guess, on the official Link Discord server.
Right.
And I think you also said that you do some like translation work. You cover current events maybe in the Russosphere.
Right. So, over the last 2 years, I have been preoccupied with different aspects of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and more in general with politics of Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. So I do some work as I would say, independent research in that area. And apart from that, I do some translation work with dead languages. I do research when it comes to Acadian, Sumerian, and classical Chinese.
All right. And you are quite the polyglot. You have like a big laundry list of living and dead languages that you speak or are familiar with.
Right.
So obviously your English and your Italian are very good, but I've heard good things about your Russian and your Mandarin as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about your languages?
Right. Okay, so I've been learning languages since I was really young because I have always found it very compelling and very interesting. And so my language learning endeavors date back at least 10 years. The first language I kind of got started in was, Spanish. Now, in Italy, we do have a fairly good school system, education system. So most Italians do get a second language education in school. I did about 10 years of Spanish, and in my case, it got me to a fairly high level. So there's that. I also studied German for 5 years, and then I kept doing it on my own for a few years after that. So I would say a good 10 years of German as well, more or less. And more recently, I have been studying, Russian and Chinese, which, oddly enough, I am most proficient in because, I happen to be using them more. Apart from those, I speak what do I speak? I know Latin fairly well, and I am very well versed in both spoken and, written Latin, which is peculiar, I guess. I know French and Portuguese to a very good extent, and Dutch as well, although I have not been speaking Dutch for a long time, so that's quite rusty there. I can speak Chinook Jogum, which is a endangered language of North America. What else? What am I forgetting? I always forget some, so I have to.
Chinook Jargon is an interesting one.
It really is. Yeah.
I am from the southeast, so very far from where Chinook jargon was spoken. But even I know a couple of words like Siwash and Bumbershoot. And
What?
these are a couple. Yeah, these are a couple of words that are, I guess, they've made their way into the English of the Pacific Northwest.
There's quite a few of them, actually. I don't know whether you've ever heard the expression muckety muck.
I've heard muckety muck. I don't know what it means.
Usually a powerful person, like the muckety mucks, like something from above. I don't know. The order came from the muckety mucks. In Chinook jargon, muck muck would mean food or to eat. And I think by extension also one who has a copious amount of food, so influential person. That's how it came to be. Also, the expression to come from the sticks, as in to come from a forest, from afar,
Okay.
or the word chuck, as in salt chuck,
As in salt chuck water.
yeah, there's quite a few of them, and that's why when I first approached Chinook Jargon, it was so appealing to me. It's quite interesting. And Sawash as well, from French savage, I think. So it's quite an intricate language, but I mean, it's a fun one at that.
Yeah, it's an interesting language. I heard it used to be quite dominant actually in the Pacific Northwest, more so than English for a long time.
Yeah.
It was sort of, I guess it's some sort of contact language among indigenous peoples, French Canadians, and English settlers.
Well, yeah. So that for a while, I think dictionaries and grammars of the Chinook Jogum happened to be bestsellers in the area. So writing a grammar of Chinook Jargon was a very good idea of making a quick buck. And well, since the jargon, it's actually a mix of languages. It's quite a lot of French, English, and a decent amount of indigenous languages, such as, well, Chinook, chiefly, but also Halakomelem, I think it's called, Haida, and a few other ones. But again, I come from Italy,
Yeah.
so it's a totally different place, and I have no relation.
Oh,
with it.
yeah. I mean, again, if you were to talk to most Americans, they would probably not be super familiar with it. They would recognize a couple of the words maybe that are used, like chuck, um, sticks, and things, but I think it's the same for most Americans. It's just not a part of our lives. But again, if
Right.
you're up in like the Seattle area, then definitely you start to see the legacy that the language left.
Right.
Yeah. So how, how did you get into Chinook jargon of all things, especially as a person who lives in Venice?
Right. So the thing is, usually when I learn a language, I have a practical reason to do so. I don't particularly like embarking on fruitless endeavors when it comes to languages because they're quite time consuming. But for Chinook jargon, I just got so much into, well, thing is, they everyone is familiar with Discord, I think, the platform, right? So someone had just created a Chinook jargon server, and at the time I had very little to do. I was quite young, again, still in high school. So I joined, and I don't know, I found it so interactive, and so, I mean, the people so passionate about reviving Chinook jargon that I was very invested from the very beginning, and I stuck with them for a long time. I wrote my own grammar, still am, by the way, and I wrote a dictionary as well, and that involved a lot of research, mostly from, well, newspapers from the area of Victoria and, well, British Columbia, so a few editions, and looking at all documents from the area, and books, those bestsellers I was talking about, and a little bit of study in other, well, indigenous languages, and it just kept going. It's really fun. I enjoy anything that even so remotely resembles archaeology or research of any kind. So just let's just say I never really learned it the academic way. I wounded up knowing it because I mean, by just practicing it on that front.
That works. And I guess being a trade language, it's fairly straightforward for adults to acquire. I don't want to
Mhm.
make like sweeping generalizations, but I feel like trade languages tend to be easier than you would expect. Um,
Yes, the vocabulary is really limited, so far so that in multiple efforts of, I mean, translating things from Chinook jargon to another language, we no, sorry, yeah, the other way around. When trying to translate things from another language to Chinook jargon, we did have a few problems with expressing complex thoughts. It does have its natural limitations, unfortunately. Well, not unfortunately, that's just how it came about to be. But so yeah, you kind of have it's a good mental exercise. It's good brain gymnastics, actually, because you have to think, how do I express things in the least intricate manner? How can I just, you know, make sure I can express things with, I don't know, I don't know how many. Chinook Jogum has a core vocabulary of, I don't know, 2,000 words maybe. How do I do things? How do I work with such a small corpus? And it's an interesting question. People are still working on different books and translation of things from different languages to Chinook Jogum. I have worked on The Little Prince, so that was a challenge. But yeah, it went really well. So yeah.
Awesome. And yeah, so I guess Chinook Jargon and definitely Sumerian are two very interesting languages that you have studied and have experience with. So, how did you come to be a Sumerian teacher? You run a course and then you record the course and you put it on YouTube.
Right.
And how did you get started in Sumerian? And what was your path to becoming a YouTube instructor in Sumerian?
All right. It's a very intricate question. So let's start from the very beginning. At some point in my life, I was really interested in religion and, the languages of religion. So in my case, when it comes to Abrahamic religion, it's mostly Koine Greek, Biblical Greek, and Biblical Hebrew, and different varieties of the language. So I did get into Biblical Hebrew first. And looking up some words, I came to find out that quite a few words in Biblical Hebrew are derived from Sumerian. And that was quite an interesting discovery at the time. I was, again, quite young. And looking at Sumerian and looking at the language overall, the features and the writing system, I was quite struck by how fascinating it was compared to, Hebrew and Greek. So I kind of put both of them on pause, and I, started getting into Sumerian. Now, at the time, I was not really able to navigate linguistic resources really well, but I was really lucky to find on Discord again a mentor. That being a person who had studied them formally in university before. So I was instructed by them, and I was really passionate about it for some reason. I kept going for quite a few years, and in this way, Sumerian kind of came to be my hobby, my go-to hobby for whenever I was feeling down or bored. I would just take a tablet and try and translate it. Never really asking myself too many questions. Why am I doing this? Is it important? Is it useful? I just kept going, and so it came to be. Now, one day I decided to make a little hub for Sumerian. So I created a Discord server in light of creating a new kind of community. And it came to be really fast. We got quite a few members joining, and a lot of people were coming from other servers, other ancient language learning servers. So at that time, I discovered that some people were running ancient, late Egyptian and Middle Egyptian, so the language and hieroglyphs of the pyramids of Egypt. They were running courses and reading groups. So people were gathering together and translating things together. And that was really appealing because until then I was always on my own doing this, either by myself or with a mentor, but never with people. So always very little interaction involved. So this time I was like, okay, I can try and make a group and maybe we can translate things together. So I, about 2 years ago, I scheduled my first reading class, I would call it. And a few people came, the thing is, from very different backgrounds. We did have a lot of people coming from academic backgrounds, so people that are very well versed in both the language and the history, and completely newbies with no experience whatsoever. And again, a lot of people just middling in the language, so not good nor bad. So the experiment it went fairly well. It was interesting, but I swiftly noticed that perhaps it would have been a more fruitful endeavor just to teach the language and make sure everyone knew Sumerian, at least to a middle to advanced level, before we could translate things together. And so I kind of stopped the reading group, which I have now resumed, and I started teaching classes. And the first year was kind of experimental. It went really well. It wasn't a lot of us. And then this year, at peak, influence, we got about, I would say 40 to 50, sign-ups. And the course finished formally, at least yesterday, and I did graduate a good 20 people. So a good experiment, I would say a success overall. And now again, we now gather and we translate things together again.
So Sumerian is written in uniform. And I made this mistake right before we got on cam, which was confusing it with Acadian.
Right.
And I imagine that happens quite a lot. Is there a lot of confusion among casual like language learners about Acadian and Sumerian?
Unfortunately, yeah, there is. I always like to make this example. When I was younger, I was, I guess, in first grade, either first or second grade, so really, really young. And we would have history textbooks. And I remember going over the Sumerians and the Babylonians, and which are Semitic,
Acadian speakers.
And they would kind of treat them as a single people. And then they would kind of credit the Sumerians with some Acadian, for Acadian finds or Acadian things, and they would just confuse the two. And I remember the textbook citing and mentioning some words allegedly, which they said were Sumerian, but were really Acadian. So I think
Sumerians sort of influenced the Babylonians, the Acadians, in a way that, like, I guess Chinese has influenced some of the countries in its sphere of influence historically, like Vietnam, Japan. I guess, is that a good apt comparison?
I would say it is, yeah. Although the big difference would be that the influence went both ways. It was mutual. So Sumerian took a few things from Acadian to a structural level as well, like the verb going at the end and things of that sort. And Acadian got chiefly a ton of vocabulary. So they complement each other really well. Both Semites, if we want to call them that, and the Sumerians appeared in the area but about the same time. So
that's an interesting part of Acadian you mentioned, is that they are the base word order, I guess, is SOV, right? The verb goes at the end, which is sort of antithetical to. So there are SOV. I think the Ethio-Semitic languages are SOV as well. But when I think of like ancient Semitic languages, I think of things like classical Arabic, biblical Hebrew, where it's verb initial. And it's interesting that, Acadian is such an old attested language to have also undergone that change. But I guess my understanding is that word order change is actually fairly common, and it can happen within just a few generations. So I think right now, the Malay spoken in Eastern Malaysia used to be verb initial, and under the influence of Standard Malay, it's become SVO.
Right. Thing is, with Acadian, you can see some changes from the old stages of the language to the most modern ones. So yeah, it does change with time. And Acadian really is the odd one out, kind of the oddball of the bunch. Also because most Semitic languages, I think they kind of share the same prepositions. Usually they're fairly similar, at least between Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, etc., etc. While in Acadian, you do have a couple which really stand out because you don't really see them in any other Semitic language. That would be ina, so in, at, on, about, and ana, for, towards. Those I don't think are encountered in any other Semitic language. I am not the expert, but I don't think I've ever encountered them in any other Semitic language. So you really think, well, how did that come to be? And I don't really have an answer to that. But yeah, Acadian is the odd one out. It's quite different from the other ones.
Interesting. So yeah, it sounds like conflation among Sumerian and Acadian is pretty common. because there was so much mutual influence. They used the same writing script. And yeah, I definitely made that very mistake this morning. So here at Refold, we take a question-inspired approach, comprehensible input. So we definitely, I know that you yourself are no stranger to textbooks, but I think a lot of the people who listen to the Refold podcast probably have not used textbooks or not used them very often. So how would you go about learning an ancient language with presumably a small corpus via an input-heavy way, attacking it with a dictionary and a grammar, essentially?
That's a very interesting question. So that, of course, that depends on, well, the vastness of the corpus, first of all. If it's small, we mean a couple inscriptions. Well, I don't think that's possible. That's definitely not viable, and I don't think that counts as studying a language. But if you have, well, a corpus that is large enough to, well, grant decent understanding of the grammar, then thing is, in my mind, I kind of tend to understand dead languages and modern languages as two different phenomena. Or if not phenomena, then I guess manifestations of the same phenomenon, which is language. I think modern languages are closer to, well, what we actually mean with language when we mention it, while dead languages are closer to, I don't know, mathematics or more notionistic kind of areas of study, because they're not as mnemonic in a way, unless you want to know how to speak it and write it and read it perfectly. So you can basically only always refer back to a dictionary, to a formula, so to say, like in maths. So naturally, the way you learn modern languages is not the way you learn dead languages usually. But for dead languages, since the speaking part is usually not as important, with maybe the exception of classical Chinese and Latin and maybe Greek for some, I think it's usually more important to have a good understanding of the grammar before you have a good understanding of, well, the words and other aspects of it all. So what I usually do is I go through textbooks, if available, which is not always the case. For Sumerian, for example, there is only one textbook, and I didn't have the luck of finding it when I started learning Sumerian. Or grammars. So basically, ice-cold explanations of the language. So if you do understand those, and then you have a dictionary you can refer to, then it's easier to learn vocabulary. So the way I would learn ancient languages has kind of become a standard procedure now. I take a textbook, I get a Google document, and I make my own kind of cheat sheet of the grammar. So I try to reduce the grammar to its minimal terms so that it's understandable and digestible. And when I have a good understanding of it, by, again, reading and doing some exercises, which usually come with the textbook, I then expand. I do some reading, and then I do some flashcards, and I consume material, I translate, and I learn, well, words and expressions on the go, well, as I am translating. And with time, you get more and more words, and then you can put them in your Anki decks if you do that, or if you're studying Latin, also in your link, vocabulary lists or whatever it's called. And well, that's how I would go about it. So yeah, once you have a good understanding of the language, how it works, you can now focus on the input. So if you have a corpus that allows it, you just confront it, you read things. And that's also very important. If you know people that do the same thing, if they study the same language, you can have a confrontation, and that kindles, well, interest, and it leads to progress with time.
Yeah, so that doesn't sound too totally far off from what Refold would recommend. Maybe forgoing the textbook in favor of just a grammar guide or a reference grammar. But yeah, interesting. And with Sumerian, what is the corpus like? Is it shopping lists? Is it names of people and things? What is the corpus of Sumerian?
All right. So the thing about Sumerian is that Sumerian literature is by nature oral. So they would talk about it. they wouldn't really write it. So most of the written records we have of anything literary was mostly written for the sake of exercises by the scribes. So we do have some also pretty long accounts of, well, works of literature, sometimes even as far as complete, and there's quite a few of them. But apart from those, well, we do have a few things. For example, one of the ways scribes would learn cuneiform, and when they were quite advanced into their studies, is by writing the whole of, or some parts of, usually the same 3 or 4 epics, or, well, works of literature. So we do have a lot of variants of those. And, well, we do have a lot of what we call the dedicatory inscriptions. So the thing is, Sumerian kings and rulers would build a lot of things and talk about them and say, I built it, so that when they passed away, the new king would come by and would read them, and they would understand, okay, so he built that, and then he would do the same thing. So we have a lot of inscriptions of that sort. And then we have a lot of juridical and economical, well, records of people, well, suing other people, or, well, buying things or writing complaints. And apart from that, we do have some, how can I describe them? Well, for example, there was a king called Gudea, and he would inscribe a whole column of text talking about his exploits, and it's quite massive, so far so that I think some German author based a Sumerian grammar solely on, well, those texts. So it's not small. I say, well, we're in the order of 10,000, so it's quite a lot of tablets. Now, how many of them are useful? Well, a good amount. How many are literary and enjoyable to read? A good amount again, although nothing compared to English or Latin or anything of that sort, or even Acadian for that matter. We do have the correspondence between kings and, well, influential people. So basically some letters saying, hey, look, you have to do that. Maybe the Amorites or some tribe is approaching, they're attacking, or I have received news from, those other people right there, and they told me that, and so we should act accordingly. So those are more private conversations, I would say. And apart from that, one really interesting phenomenon would be the lexical lists, which remotely resemble, I would say, dictionaries. So you would have the Acadian, or, well, usually the Sumerian character, so the Sumerian equivalent of a word. Then you would have the Acadian version and counterpart, so that they themselves could kind of study them, because, well, Acadians did, well, learn Sumerian in school, presumably. Well, the scribes, that is. So sometimes you have the spelling as well. It's quite interesting. So they're quite diverse.
When we never really defined cuneiform. I guess most people are aware that it's like little wedges pushed in clay, right? It's a non-linear script. It's not made by making lines like most scripts that we know of today. But instead it was made by pushing a wedge into clay.
Right.
And Acadian and Sumerian share cuneiform, kinda. And I guess it's sort of like the Han unification thing, where like Hong Kong, China, Korea, and Japan have different variants of similar characters, maybe, and maybe some locally innovated characters that are not shared. But can you tell when you're I speak Filipino, and Filipino is actually only the native language of about 30% of the Philippines.
Wow.
Most people speak it as an L2, similar to, I guess, standard Italian a few generations ago. And you can kind of tell when someone is not native. They're not a Tagalog ethnically. Maybe they grew up in a different part of the country with a different native language. There are some grammatical giveaways, maybe weird use of discourse particles, weird conjugations, things like that. Can you tell if somebody's like not Sumerian? Maybe they're an Akkadian scribe trying to communicate in Sumerian, and they're like, Are there any giveaways that they're not a native Sumerian? Can you tell Acadian influenced Sumerian?
Yes. Acadians, well, the thing is, that being Acadian is a Semitic language, while Sumerian is, as far as we know, isolate. So their phonetic repertoire is quite different. So sometimes, sounds don't really click. Sumerian speakers are not presumably able to pronounce all the sounds of Akkadian, and likewise the Akkadians cannot do the same thing. And apart from that, they also confuse the signs. For example, k and g in Akkadian are almost the same thing, one sound. While in Sumerian, it's quite a fundamental difference. So in Akkadian, they tend to when Akkadians write in Sumerian, they tend to confuse the two at times. Same thing for sh and s. So sometimes you're like, oh yeah, this should be a sh, but it's actually a s. That means that the scribe was probably Akkadian. And apart from that, they do sometimes they don't get the vowels right. And so that's a giveaway as well. And what else? The thing is, and naturally, having learned Sumerian in school, in academias and scribe schools, they are bound to making mistakes. So sometimes they make genuine mistakes. Verbal forms sometimes don't make a lot of sense, and they kind of stray from the Sumerian kind of canonic usage. So you see a lot of that. Also because, Sumerian came to be the cultic language of the Semites at a certain point, of the Babylonians. So they did some heavy use of Sumerian, and you can see that, and it's definitely Akkadian's writing. As I said, there's a few things that give it away. So yeah, you can definitely see when a speaker is Akkadian.
Interesting. Yeah, that's again something that I feel like a lot of people have not experienced. If you're learning German, for example, I imagine that most German is made by native speakers for natives, but there are a whole bunch of languages out there like Swahili, Indonesian, Filipino, where the bulk of speakers are not native, and you run into this sort of non-native form quite often of the language, and it's interesting that this phenomenon goes back thousands of years to
Right.
the ancient Babylonians and the Sumerians.
Yeah, it's also very evident in the Russophone sphere when you have people that either grew up in the Soviet Union and are now living in the former Soviet republics, or people that studied maybe in Moscow or different regions of Russia, then came back to their neighboring countries. For example, the other day, I was talking to a Moldovan friend who is very well versed in Russian, and their Russian is so good that if I didn't know they were Moldovan, I would assume they were from Russia. And the only thing that gave it away, the fact that they were not Russian, is a mistake basically in the grammar. So they said Hochim instead of Hakim, which I think makes more sense in Moldovan, in Romanian, than it does in Russian. So few things give it away. And it's also very evident in, when you speak to Ukrainians who know Russian, because, their pronunciation is quite different. They pronounce G differently. They say H and not G. So, yeah. And also they use a lot of vocabulary that is, specific to the area. Same thing for Belarus. Sometimes they do mix some, local words with the standard language, and it's especially noticeable when it comes to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. They do use a lot of varieties of the words, and yeah.
Interesting. So, how long does the corpus of Sumerian span? How many years?
Well, thousands. The oldest stage of Sumerian, I say, dates back 3,000 years from 5,000 years from now, I would say. So 3,000 BC, basically, in a few cities in Mesopotamia. We call it proto-cuneiform because, well, it's a very much rudimental representation of Sumerian, and we can't be sure that that's actually Sumerian because the language there is so pictographic and it doesn't resemble at all the spoken language. So there's nothing clear that says that the language is indeed Sumerian. And
It's like a proto writing, I guess.
yeah, so it could be imported from somewhere else, or it could be like native Sumerian, autochthonous Sumerian as well. We just can't know. And well, it spans of a few thousand years. I think we do have. We do have.
So, given that Sumerian has a long history,
Yep.
do you focus on a certain period? An example would be like Latinists focusing purely on classical Latin and ignoring medieval or archaic Latin. Is that common among people who study Sumerian to focus on a set? I'm going to study Sumerian from this point to this point and ignore the other stuff, or is it more holistic?
That's a very good question. The thing is, most grammars of Sumerian are based on a variety of Sumerian, which is limited in time. So, for example, again, if you go far back, then the language is quite different because not the language itself, but the way it's written. So if you go again to proto-cuneiform, then it's very much not indicative of the spoken language, and going on with time, it becomes more and more indicative of the spoken language. So you can derive more grammatical notions from it. So usually you have to draw a line. You say, okay, before this, the language is not indicative of what is being spoken, and we can't really study the grammar from there. So anything before this is not really useful for my studies. So most people do that. Some people, though, they focus on the language when it was not very well indicative of again, spoken language. So there are some studies in that, but it's harder to, again, draw conclusions. So yes, and well, also it really much depends on what people want to do with Sumerian. I have a friend, for example, that studies, how can I put it? Some aspects of the economy in some cities at some point in the history of Mesopotamia. So they are, of course, very much interested in economical vocabulary, so niche vocabulary, and coming from a certain time period in a certain area. And there are other people like myself who are interested in Sumerian as a whole, so all the periods, all the compositions. So
what is it like? So first off, I know very little about Sumerian. So Acadian being Semitic, I have an idea, fusional, the consonantal root patterns and stuff, and but Sumerian being an isolate, what type of language is it? What is it morphologically? Is it agglutinative? Is it isolating?
It is agglutinative, like Turkish.
Okay.
So that when I was in Kazakh,
highly suffixing.
Yes.
Okay.
It's very similar to Turkish, actually. It's so that some people have suggested a possible link between the two, although I don't buy it yet.
Turonists.
Yeah, but thing is, being used to Sumerian, when I was tasked with learning Kazakh, that came very easy, actually, because I was ready, used to having to add suffixes and prefixes and the verbal forms coming in different ways, and then finite verbs and non-finite verbs. It did kindle some benefits when it comes to language learning. It did help me out in a few situations. So yeah, it's agglutinative, and I can't say for certain what it sounds like because again, it's quite a trivial matter. So I wouldn't dare pronouncing Sumerian words actually, but it resembles Turkish in more than a way, and Turkic language.
Okay. And are there any changes from the oldest
forms of the language to the youngest forms of the language.
Yes.
So, obviously, like English has changed a whole bunch, even going back just a couple hundred years. You know, in modern standard English, we would say the house is being built. But if you go back 200 or 300 years to early modern English, Shakespearean English, you would say the house is building. And there are all these little things that even native speakers of English may not pick up on. What are some of the changes across time that you see in Sumerian?
So the thing about Sumerian is the written language tends to remain fairly compact in time. It doesn't change that much. So there is a very, I guess the most noticeable change is in the suffixes and prefixes. So you have some prefixes which tend to be like chiefly used in earlier stages of Sumerian, which kind of lose some of their functions as they go on with time. And that's very noticeable because in the later stages of Sumerian, there's only a few of them being used. And what else? Well, as you go, of course, you have more and more influence from Acadian, and that is to be expected. But overall, and some grammatical cases get simplified. And again, the thing is, Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language at some point. So from some point onwards, someone was learning it and writing in it as a dead language. So naturally, they would make some mistakes and they would modify it a little bit. So from a certain point, probably, it stopped being authentic. So that's also very interesting.
Interesting. So this, I was under the impression that the whole time that Sumerian was being written in, it would have been a living language. But it sounds to me like maybe due to its sort of status as a regional lingua franca and then also a liturgical language, there were a whole bunch of L2 speakers writing in it.
Right. Yeah, the thing is, as far as we know, I am not a trained Assyriologist, but it is my understanding that at a certain point, Semites outnumbered Sumerians in Mesopotamia. So Sumerians gradually became a minority. And what often happens with minorities is they start speaking another language while perhaps maintaining Sumerian in their household. Or
to varying degrees, yeah.
Yeah.
You see this a lot in the United States. We have a lot of Spanish speakers, but we got like 50 million. We've got more than like Spain. For you Europeans who don't understand the size of America, and you see this where a lot of our Spanish speakers are first generation, so they grew up in a Spanish-speaking country and they moved to the States. Very quickly, the second generation use it as a home language, the heritage speakers, and almost immediately problems arise. Maybe regularizing gender. So, obviously you speak Spanish, right? So you know that hand looks masculine, but it's technically a feminine noun. And so they might, I've seen it actually in the Philippines as well. I've seen I don't know if it's a charity or something, sort of like Goodwill, where you donate stuff. It's called Segundo Mano. And I'm like,
Yeah.
So like you see these sorts of issues arise relatively quickly. So I can imagine that very quickly Sumerians started having this sort of heritage speaker form of the language where things were different. Because it happens very quickly in the United States with immigrant languages.
Right. The thing is, the problem with Sumerian is that, with Mesopotamia in general, is that writing is reserved to some part of life that usually does not concern the, average kind of citizen. While down, south in, Egypt and stuff, you do have all sorts of letters being exchanged, like between normal people. People saying, "Okay, you need to work more," or
There's
why don't you ever
there's
write
a
back? Hmm.
there's a famous clay tablet of someone complaining about the quality of, I don't know, iron or copper or something. Is that Sumerian?
No, it's Acadian. The name
It's
is
Acadian. Okay.
Ea Nazir, and they do write in Acadian. So yeah, it becomes definitely more common with Acadian, but with Sumerian, it's non-existent. We just do not have that. Apart
Okay.
from, well, the correspondence, but it's again between kings. But we don't know anything about the average Joe in Mesopotamia, so we don't know anything about their daily life. Well, close to nothing. So it's hard to like get a sense and, well, depth when it comes to understanding, kind of the intricacies and the how it worked. I mean, what they used to speak at home, what they didn't, and the longs and shorts of life in Mesopotamia, and how Sumerian came to become a dead language. It's just beyond us.
Interesting. Now, shifting gears here, do you also do calligraphy? Is that right?
Well, for Sumerian, I don't, because I don't have
Okay.
clay. But
But
when it comes to Chinese, quite a bit. I mean, I can write Chinese, and I occasionally do some writing. Although I have friends that specialize in that, I am able to do it. Although I'm not the best at it. Quite admittedly.
okay. One of the questions I got from the community was, would you get into um, penmanship for something like Chinese? So generally, uh, we don't recommend learning to write. You can if you want, but it's not a core process. It's not needed for literacy, and unless you live in country, you're fine using something like pinyin or some sort of input like that. But people are interested in it. So, what would your advice be to budding young um, Chinese learners who want to start working on their penmanship?
So the thing is, okay, my advice might look very much underwhelming, but just hear me out. Thing is, I would invest in a good pen, because I think everything that is written like in a very appealing manner just motivates you, and just keeps me going all the time. So I look at my notes, I'm like, okay, this is very well written. I'm gonna keep doing this because it's so putting a little bit of aesthetism in your notes usually helps. So I have mine right here. This is what I use for writing Chinese with a pen. I also have some brushes over there. And I would then proceed to buy a good manual. There's a lot of, I mean, for well, Mandarin Chinese in general, there's a lot of manuals and grammars and material being made, especially now in the last over the last 10 years. It's been skyrocketing. So you can easily find ones like it's easy to come across like calligraphy and Mandarin material. So you just get one, you do the exercises. One thing you can do is you can buy one of those. Oh, I don't know what they're called in English.
Probably what we call a copybook, which is where like they've got little grids, and then you practice on the grid, maybe.
Yeah, you do have the grids, but you basically what you do is you don't use ink, you use water, and you can just get the brush wet, and then you would write in the boxes. It would become black, and with time it would fade and just dry out, and you would have an empty box again.
I'm not sure what we would call that.
Yeah, a water. That's a good question. I'm not sure myself, but that's what my friends use, and it's quite a method actually. But I would again learn like stroke order. That's a classic. It's a must-have, and then actually it depends. The thing about Chinese is that there's not one only style you can learn. There's more. So there's the current style. There's the in Chinese it's called 草书, which translates to
Grass script.
yeah, grass. When 草 is grass when used as a noun, but as an adjective it means more like informal or like things of that
Gotcha.
sort. So it's kind of like cursive in English. You know, the doodles.
Flowing.
So you have to have a clear mind on what you want to do and what you want to achieve with, well, calligraphy. So, and then you can find a good manual, you can go from there. Then maybe you can even look at other people doing it. You can look at whatever work of calligraphy we have. There's a few ones you can look at. One Kaiser for starters, or sorry, Gukaiger, I think. Yeah, Gukaiger, perhaps. Again, I'm not the expert here. But yeah, I would just get very good raw materials, a good manual, and just go from there. Learn the stroke order, and then knowing the radicals, of course, is also a necessary step in learning how to write Chinese. But if we want to master, well, calligraphy, that takes a lot of time and a lot of ink. So make sure you have good ink and a lot of time.
Very interesting. This is totally beyond me. I know nothing about calligraphy in general, or different types of ink. I know India ink is a thing. I know ink stones are a thing, but that's where my awareness of calligraphy ends. Like, yes, there are different types of ink of different types of thickness. But that's it. So this is interesting to me.
Well, the thing is, it's definitely not necessary to know anything about calligraphy if you want to learn Mandarin Chinese. It's kind of like a coronary thing you do if you're really into it. I must say,
For
it's
sure.
not my focus as well.
Yeah, and this is definitely that sort of question, because officially most people in the Refold community don't really learn to write, and if they do, it might be with just a ball pen.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't recommend to learning. I don't recommend to learn like calligraphy at all. Like, unless you want to do that for the sake of it, because it's beautiful. If you want to like hang your works on the wall, that's fine. If that's by any means tied or related to your work, sure.
So that pen that you held up, is it a dip pen or does it have a cartridge?
It's a dip pen. I also have the ink somewhere, I think. Somewhere around these parts. Yes. There it is. So I do have ink. And I just... And I think I also have my manual here somewhere. Wait. This is a starter manual.
All right. Very cool.
It's just got a lot of characters and you go through them. And yeah.
Interesting. So, looking here, we are nearing the end of our hour, but before we go, I did have a couple more questions. So,
sure.
Being that you have studied an eclectic mix of languages and you're quite competent in a few of them, obviously your English, your Russian, your Italian, are quite good. What have you found to be the most challenging? And I don't want to say difficult, because I think difficulty is relative. Obviously, if you are a native speaker of a Sino-Xenic language, then you have a ton of vocab if you're going from Vietnamese to Mandarin or something. But in your experience, what caused you the most issues learning a language?
Right, so I don't really have an objective answer to that. However, I would say at the time, back in the day, I did find German fairly hard, mostly because of the rigid kind of grammatical structures and the fact that you have to put different parts of the sentence in a certain way, depending on what kind of clause it was. So at the time, I was a very unskilled language learner, and I did find it really difficult. So German, if we talk about, well, the Indo-European kind of scene, I would say is the hardest one for me. Spanish definitely wasn't a challenge. French, yeah, not even close. And of course, Russian is interesting because, well, you have a totally different...
So, as an English speaker, the U.S. State Department would rate Russian harder than German for me as a native speaker of English. So I find it interesting that for you found the case of Russian being easier. Was that because you were a more experienced language learner at that point, or is there just something about the structure that vibes with you more than German?
Well, both. I would say that the thing with Russian is that it's a really free language. You can kind of position parts of the sentence inside of the sentence freely, so you have a little bit more freedom, and that's surely, I mean, easier on the learner as you go. And the other thing is a lot of a lot of Russian words are derived from Latin, or they resemble Romance languages. So, and you also don't have articles in Russian. So you have some parts of speech that we deem as, well, necessary, and which we make very copious use of in English, Italian, and so on and so forth, which are completely, not completely, but fairly alien to, well, Slavic languages. So you have to imagine you're coming into a language which doesn't really have very difficult, well, sentence structure. It doesn't have articles. Yes, it does have case, but I mean, what you said about Russian being harder than German makes perfect sense for a lot of people. Perhaps it's just me. Thing is, I had the fortune of learning German when I was really young, so that helped. And coming into Russian as a more experienced language learner, I found it to be easier, actually, to be dealing with cases instead of prepositions and things of that sort.
So one thing I find interesting is, as a native English speaker, we take for granted a lot of the verbs in Germanic languages. So while we may not have necessarily as many unique conjugations, we do have the phenomenon of phrasal verbs or split verbs. And when I look at split verbs in Dutch, not German, I don't really mess with German too much. They feel very easy to me. They feel totally normal, being that I'm an English speaker. They remind me of phrasal verbs. Um, Whereas I see a lot of people struggle with that when they're not a Germanic language speaker. And I think sometimes Romance speakers and Germanic speakers are unfairly grouped together. Yes, we've influenced each other a lot over the years. You know, there's words like blanco and branco and stuff that came from Germanic and vice versa. But our languages really are different. We've got articles, but we use them in different ways. And the verbs are very different. I always try and drive this home because a lot of our listeners are learning things like Japanese or Mandarin. You know, they're not learning a European language. And there's just something I maintain that I still struggle after years with Spanish verbs when it comes to like making sure that I'm using things in the subjunctive and stuff. And I think sometimes we Germanic speakers are unfairly grouped with Romance speakers and vice versa, when really they're quite different languages.
Well, first of all, English is quite the exception because in modern way it resembles more like Romance languages, I say, than Germanic languages. Also in the vocabulary, it's quite a lot influenced by French. So some people even define it as a ad honorem Romance language. I don't agree 100%, but some people find it to be the case, and that means something, of course. And I would also say that verbs are indeed the hardest thing to learn in most languages, at least for me, except, well, of course, when you have conjugations and stuff. In analytic languages, that doesn't apply. And the problem with, like, phrasal verbs in German, for me, and for my classmates at the time, wasn't the verb itself, but rather the thing that the fact that you have a verb and then you have a preposition, and then that you have to use a certain case after the preposition, and that would mess with most people's brains and stuff. And that's where I guess input comes in. If you hear them in sentences, then it becomes clearer with time. You just understand it by osmosis, by just being exposed to it. And that's also one of the reasons why I find Russian to be easier in that regard. It's got less tense, so you just have the future, I mean, two kinds of future, two kinds of past, and the present. And the verbs, you don't have phrasal verbs in Russian. At least I wouldn't deem them to be phrasal verbs. You do have a lot of prefixes that you can attach to verbs, and they would change your meaning. but it's really just that. And the case that you use with verbs, it's predictable more than with German and stuff. So
Right. I feel like the German case system is very opaque, and also the German gender system is very opaque. So I feel like my rough understanding of Slavic languages is that it's very apparent if something's feminine, masculine, or neuter. Whereas with German, it's not very clear from the
exactly.
get-go.
Yeah, very little exceptions in Russian. Like on the top of my head, I can only think of coffee, which is coffee in Russian, which ends in E, which would technically be considered a neuter word. However, it appears to be masculine. It's masculine, so you would treat it as such. But so far, so there's some people, again, perhaps second language speakers of Russian confuse it for a neuter word as well. And the words for mother and father, so papa and mama. Mama of course is feminine, stays feminine, but papa is again a masculine word, which of course ending in a resembles more a feminine word. But apart from those, there's a very limited amount of words that kind of tricks the learner into thinking it's one thing and then it's the other. It's very little exceptions.
Interesting. So, Gabriele, we are about at our time here. Before we go, do you have any parting words, any words of wisdom?
That's a good question. All you need to learn a language is a book, a textbook, a good pen, and a marker. I would say that is usually my motto, my go-to sentence when it comes to language learning.
I love that motto because there are a lot of people out there who think that if you don't have hundreds of hours of anime and manga to read and watch, you're not going to learn a language. And I think that's not the case, right?
Yeah. Also, if you do have that, but you don't have a good textbook and a good notebook, and most definitely if you do not have a pen, that's a lot of resources you have, but concretely you can't do anything about it. So you start small, you take a notebook, you write things down. It helps a lot, trust me. It looks beautiful as well. It motivates you. And then you don't need to use 100 colors and stuff. You just take a textbook, and the words you don't know, you mark them in yellow. That's what I do. I have one marker on my desk. That's it. That's what I use. When I run out of them, I just buy 10. And then they run out and I buy more. So I don't really use anything else. Again, one pen, one marker, a lot of textbooks, and a lot of notebooks. And then anything else, well, that's just extra. That's a privilege. But you start small, and you don't have to be perfect. Like a lot of people come into language learning, they're like, okay, when I'm going to reach B2, then what am I going to do? I'm like, it's okay. Or like people ask, how do I get good at, let's say German? Because I don't really have the chance in my day-to-day life of speaking with Germans. I'm like, with German speakers. And I'm like, well, do you have budget? Is the language meaningful to, your existence right now? And most people say, well, no, I just like it. So I'm like, okay, that's perfect. You could say that with perfect utility, but you have to understand that you don't have to be perfect then. Like, you can allow yourself the pleasure of just learning the language without being perfect. So it doesn't really matter whether you make a mistake or not. Just go for it and enjoy it.
Right. And Gabriele, thank you for the advice. Thank you for coming on. And I will see you around.
Bye.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.